Could you have survived in 1860s Russia as a homosexual? Our protagonist today, Pyotr Ilyich Tchaikovsky, not only did that, but he became the most important Russian composer of all time. But his was not an easy road. Everything in Tchaikovsky's story was tragedy, emotion, and a lot of music.
Welcome to Trembol Podcast, the place for music stories that thrill.
Chapter 1, A Big Family and Great Loneliness. Hello, I'm Pyotr Ilyich Tchaikovsky. I was born on April 25, 1840 in Votkinsk, a small Russian town located 600 kilometers from Moscow, at the foot of the Urals. I'm sure you've seen my name written in many ways. In English, it's
Pyotr Ilyich Tchaikovsky.
And in Russian, it's
Pyotr Ilyich Tchaikovsky.
My father, Ilya Petrovich Tchaikovsky, was a mining engineer who worked for the state. My mother, Alexandra Andreevna, of French origin, was a good singer and pianist. She was the second of my father's 3 wives. My family was extensive. I had 4 siblings, Nikolai, Ippolit, twins Anatoly and Modest, and a sister, Alexandra. There was also my half-sister Zinaida, the result of my father's first marriage. In my family, they loved music. In fact, I was not the only one who would dedicate himself to art. My brother Modest was a playwright, librettist, and translator. Another thing my brother Modest and I would share was our sexual orientation. My homosexuality was first hidden by me, then covered up by my brother, then by my family, and for decades by the entire Soviet regime. My childhood was not at all common. My parents used to be very busy, so from the age of 3, they put me in a French governess to take care of me, Fanny Durbach, who taught me French and German. My mother, Alexandra, was a cold, unhappy, and somewhat distant woman, although I idolized her. I will confess that I even had a fetish with his hands. She is undoubtedly the woman I loved the most in my entire life.
I love you.
When I was only 5 years old, I began to take piano lessons, quickly becoming an outstanding student. You won't believe it, but before long, I was able to read sheet music without any effort. My Nana Fanny said that I had music inside me, so much so that it tormented me at night. Although my talent was obvious, my parents did not want me to be an artist. So in 1850, at the age of 10, I was sent to the Imperial School of Jurisprudence in St. Petersburg, an institution from which the only thing that came out were officials for the state. The day I left was the most traumatic of my life. Saying goodbye to my mother caused me a crying attack and extreme panic. To make matters worse, the age of access to that school was 12 years old. As I was still 10, I had to spend 2 years away from my home in a boarding school. Once I entered the school, I would spend the next 7 years of my life studying there. As you can imagine, it was a school only for men in the middle of adolescence, so homosexual exploration was constant. While I was there, in 1854, my mother would die of cholera. This event made me get closer to music again. I tried to compose a waltz as a tribute to her. Although the arts were not the school's strong suit, I regularly attended theater and opera with friends. I was passionate about the works of Rossini, Bellini, Verdi, and Mozart. As my preference for music was still latent, my father would allow me to take piano lessons again, this time with the prestigious professor Rudolf Kundigin. Did you know what this famous professor said about me?
You have no special talent for music.
There are people with vision, right? Finally, I graduated in 1859, at the age of 19, with the lowest rank of the civil servant career. A little later, I would begin my journey in the Ministry of Justice, where I climbed the ranks until 3 years later I decided to leave the civil service. My homosexuality, which had not been strange in school, had become a secret because in Russia homosexuals were fined, so I lived a double life. On the one hand, I was a serious civil servant, and on the other, a happy man who fully enjoyed his sexuality with other men, but among a lot of alcohol, games, and expenses. Chapter 2, Who are the 5? During my years as a civil servant, I attended the Russian Musical Society, where I took music theory classes. Shortly afterwards, I followed in the footsteps of my teacher, Nikolai Zaremba, moving to the St. Petersburg Conservatory. For 3 years, I learned everything related to harmony, counterpoint, and fugue, to which I added what the director of the conservatory, Anton Rubinstein, taught me about instrumentation and composition. My goal was clear, to compose like the great masters of classical music, Joseph Haydn, Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart, and Ludwig van Beethoven, making my compositions go beyond the borders of Russia, always showing the musical essence of my country. This is how I began to adapt and modify classic Western norms in my own style, avoiding the path marked by my teachers and classmates. Since I had left the civil service, I had all the time to think about notes and chords. Thus, after graduating in 1865, I devoted myself entirely to composing my first symphony. When I showed it to my professors, they were impressed. Although when I first presented it publicly in 1868, I received some criticism. I would eventually be accused by nationalists of being Europeanized, and by Europeans of being too Russian. Despite this, in 1869, I began to associate with some of the great nationalist composers, such as Mikhail Balakirev, leader of the Five.
The Five was a group of composers belonging to the Russian Romantic nationalist movement. This circle was composed of Mikhail Balakirev, Alexander Borodin, Cesar Cui, Modest Mussorgsky, and Nikolai Rimsky-Korsakov, musicians with the same concerns and objectives in terms of musical creation.
The purpose of all of them was to highlight Russian musical art, leaving aside the mere reproduction of sounds from European music. To do this, they took progressive musicians such as Frédéric Chopin, Franz Liszt, and Robert Schumann as references. In my case, as an outstanding student of Rubinstein, I did use popular songs in my works, following certain Western practices when composing, which caused me to have confrontations with the Five. From my close relationship with the leader of the Five, Mikhail Balakirev, would emerge in 1869 the Overture fantasy Romeo and Juliet, one of the most recognized masterpieces of my career. I will confess that this work is secretly dedicated to a very intense, passionate, and frustrated love with a fellow student of the conservatory. My rough edges with the members of Los Cinco were smoothed out, although I would never have a close relationship with most of its members.
Nope.
The year 1868 was a very busy year for me on a personal level. I had a crush on the Belgian soprano Désirée Artaud, with whom I even got engaged. Despite being my muse in compositions such as the Romance in F minor for piano, a year later our relationship would suddenly end because Artaud got engaged to one of the members of my group. Returning to music, the final movement of my second symphony, subtitled Little Russia, was very well received at its premiere in 1872. My first solid and successful works, symphonies, chamber music, songs. In all of them I hid fragments of my personal history, my pain, my secret, my fear of being discovered, the eternal attempt to deny my homosexual nature. Chapter 3, Tchaikovsky's Golden Age. I would be admitted to the chair of the Moscow Conservatory, which would give me greater independence from the Five, which would separate shortly after. Soon, a new group called the Belyayev Circle would emerge, with whose members I had a much closer relationship. Yahoo! I combined my work as a composer with the elaboration of music criticisms. The truth is that the decade of the 70s was wonderful musically, including great works such as the First Concerto for Piano and Orchestra. Premiered in 1875, it is one of the most famous piano concertos ever written. The funny thing is that my teacher and idol, Nikolai Rubinstein, criticized the play brutally, saying that everything was wrong. I didn't pay any attention to him, and I didn't change a single note. Another of the outstanding works was Variations on a Rococo Theme. I dedicated it to the cellist Wilhelm Fitzenhagen, a professor at the Moscow Conservatory, who premiered it in that same city in 1877. But without a doubt, my most popular work was Swan Lake. Premiered in 1877, Swan Lake was the first ballet score that Tchaikovsky wrote. Believe it or not, it was a box office failure initially. My personal life was still a real mess. The fact that I had to hide my homosexuality meant that when I could vent, I did it excessively. I had hidden relationships with other musicians, with servitude, and although I also regret it, with underage boys who prostituted themselves. Sometimes I even dressed as a woman in private. In the midst of this storm, my creativity rose to stratospheric levels, and from that period of confusion, my fourth symphony, one of the most valued by critics, was born. Of all my symphonies, it is perhaps the one that best tells what my life was like, a torture with a terrible fate stalking me all the time and reaching me at the end. Although for a while I contemplated the idea of entering a monastery, in 1877, to silence the rumors about my sexuality, to please my family and by the desire to form my own, I would marry Antonina Miliukova, one of my former composition students. From this period is my symphonic poem, Fatum. It is a very representative work of my style with motifs associated with fate and tragedy, as well as the use of Russian folk and folk music associated with fun and partying. My marriage became an ordeal for both of us. Antonina and I never really got together. I was in constant fear that she would rat me out, telling everyone that I was gay. This caused me to enter a state of crisis that led me to leave Russia, taking refuge in Switzerland to rest and recover. You know, there is nothing more in vain than trying to be someone other than who you are by nature. During my stay in Switzerland, I composed with the help of the violinist Josef Kotek, the Violin Concerto, a work that was not as well received as expected. In fact, the work was booed at its premiere in Vienna, and not even the recipient of the piece, Eduard Hanslick, seemed to find the meaning of it. Today is considered one of the most beautiful, spectacular, luminous, and optimistic concertos for violin and orchestra ever written, although the reality is that with it, I wanted to cover up the terrible personal moment I was living. Thanks to the violinist Joseph Kotek, I would meet Nadezhda von Meck, a wealthy widow of one of the tycoons of the railway industry, who would become my patron. Yahoo! Chapter 4. Finding Your Place in the World. After my failed marriage, I returned to teach at the Moscow Conservatory in 1879. Although thanks to Nadezhda von Meck's generous monthly donations, I was able to leave it by concentrating exclusively on composition. Nadezhda set me only 2 conditions to be my patron. The first, that I maintain a fluid communication with her by letter. We would send more than 1,000 letters over the years, in which we opened up completely to each other. The second condition was that we would never see each other in person. With my income secured, I dedicated myself to traveling to several cities in Russia and Europe. That was what my life would be like until 1890, when due to a severe economic crisis, Nadezhda had to stop financing me. Long before that, in 1880, I was commissioned to compose a work to commemorate the defeat of Napoleon Bonaparte in 1812 at the Battle of Borodino. With Tsar Alexander I as a witness, I presented the 1812 Overture, a piece far removed from my usual symphonic style. Although the audience liked it very much, in my opinion, it is a very noisy play and completely lacking in artistic merit, since I wrote it without warmth or love. In 1881, I received the news of the death of my teacher Rubinstein in Paris. I would dedicate my piano trio in a minor to him. One of the things that scared me the most was directing my own plays. Believe it or not, I imagined that my head would fall while conducting the orchestra. The fact is that I overcame that fear and started touring as a director of my own music. When I wasn't on tour, I lived a somewhat hermit life away from others. In 1884, I received the important Order of Saint Vladimir, bestowed by Tsar Alexander III. This decoration was the demonstration of the support I had obtained as a composer. In fact, my next work, premiered in 1885, the Third Orchestral Suite, would be a resounding success. Motivated by this honor, I returned to my country accepting a new commission from the Tsar, the production of Eugene Onegin, which is considered my best opera with a luxury staging. Thanks to this work, the Tsar would grant me a lifetime pension of 3,000 rubles a year. This would be about $30 today, but for the time it was a lot of money. In 1887, I made my debut as guest conductor of the opera Cherevichki, something I needed since success at the time depended a lot on whether or not you conducted your own works. Little by little, I overcame my stage fright, visiting more and more European cities on tour. With all the experience I had accumulated, I would premiere my Fifth Symphony in 1888. and a little later, Hamlet in St. Petersburg. As my first ballet, Swan Lake, was already recognized worldwide, in 1889 I decided to compose another one called Sleeping Beauty. It is based on the story of the same name by Charles Perrault, today one of the most famous ballets. As I was telling you, my fame became worldwide, so in 1891 I would travel to North America, where I conducted the New York Symphony Orchestra. There I would consecrate myself again, but internally I was still tormented, hiding my love affairs with young men and nobles. Chapter 5. The Master's Final Years. In 1891, I would compose my third and last ballet, The Nutcracker, consisting of several dances, such as the Trepak, a dance based on Ukrainian folklore. The Nutcracker is one of my favorite works. It was premiered in 1892. Despite its enormous current popularity, critics were not exactly complimentary after the premiere. Two years later, in 1893, I received an honorary degree as Doctor of Music from the University of Cambridge. Most unexpectedly, at the height of my career inside and outside Russia's borders, I died in St. Petersburg on November 6, 1893. My death was so sudden that it happened only 6 days after the premiere of my Sixth Symphony, the Pathétique. My death is one of the greatest mysteries in the history of music. I died of cholera, a disease that was easily acquired by drinking contaminated water, but bourgeois like me always drank boiled water, so there is speculation whether it was a mistake or if I did it on purpose to deliberately end my life. Be that as it may, what I had anticipated in many of my works about a tragic final destiny would end up being fulfilled.
From Russia to the world. That was Tchaikovsky, a composer from whom some of the best works in the history of music were born. According to Tchaikovsky research, there are more than 14,000 recordings and 43,000 editions of his music. Whether it is his concerts, his operas, or his very famous ballets, Swan Lake, Sleeping Beauty, and The Nutcracker, what is certain is that Tchaikovsky's legacy is eternal. Thank you for joining us until the end. If you like the video, please subscribe and share it with everyone.
Thank you very much, Trembles. We love you.